Video by Emmanuel Isaiah Smith.
Hello, good evening. It is your host, Emmanuel Isaiah Smith, and today's date is Wednesday, December 3rd, 2025. The time is 8:36 p.m., and I'm in Kendall, Florida. The topic of today's lecture is Cuba, Terrorism, and the Gangstalking Connection Part II, the reality angle. Now, I've decided to do a second video, ladies and gentlemen, on the situation in Cuba. Back in November, there was a U.S. ambassador by the name of Mike Waltz who announced to at least a 100-member UN committee that Cuba, the country that is less than 100 miles off the coast of Miami-Dade County, is a state sponsor of terrorism, human trafficking, and cartel activity. What this says to me, ladies and gentlemen, is that in the governmental reaches of the Cuban territorial establishment, there's corruption. And whenever you see particularly mob-like or what you might refer to as mafioso behavior among elected officials of any country, anywhere in the world, there's typically a corruption element behind it. Now, ladies and gentlemen, here's why I say that, okay? Everything that the Cuban state is being accused of right now, okay, is a for sale commodity in open markets. It's the black market. It's what you might refer to as the underground market, but it's still a market. Okay, terrorism is for sale, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, long gone are the days that saw independent, overzealous, ultra-nationalistic types organizing mobs of people and organizing mobs of people, assigning a name to the new mob, and then carrying out what might be described as the most extreme antisocial activities you could ever imagine. They're otherwise known as terrorist activity. Ladies and gentlemen, the trajectory of terrorism has changed over the past 30 years. There was a time where the very word terrorism was associated with either far-right activists in the United States, for example, neo-Nazi groups, or people that would associate themselves with groups that are seen as extreme right or far right, or you saw these actions by left-wing or far-left groups in the United States. And these far left groups were groups that some were semi-communist in nature, some were semi-anarchist in nature. But regardless of who it's coming from, the extreme right or the extreme left, regardless of who it's coming from, these acts, whether or not they're politically motivated or not, are seen as terroristic acts or acts of domestic terrorism. Now, we haven't seen very many leftist acts of terrorism of domestic terrorism in this country over the past 50 years. But there was a time, particularly in the late 60s to late 70s, where the United States saw a surge of left-wing militants that committed acts that were tantamount to what some might describe as terrorism. Well, the FBI would describe as terrorism, and there's a fairly standard definition for what a terrorist act is. It's one that causes extreme distress, fear, anxiety, injury, or even death to massive numbers of people in a short period of time. The definition has been loosened a little bit. There have been a number of murder cases in the United States that have been tried with a terrorist specification to them, even though the perpetrator of the crime was not affiliated with any particular terrorist network. He was still they're still charging certain persons with terrorism for committing certain heinous acts. So the definition has morphed to a degree. But, beyond the various attacks that you might have seen from the far left in the 60s and 70s period, and then the various far right-wing acts of terrorism. For example, Timothy McVeigh, in 1995, he used a homemade bomb to essentially decimate the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in downtown Oklahoma City. And that event sparked an interest in the American far right because Timothy McVeigh was a pamphleteer for Dr. William Luther Pierce, who was the founder of the National Alliance, a far-right group that distributes materials on racial identity and cosmotheism, which was his homemade church. The trajectory of left-wing and right-wing domestic terrorism in this country is interesting and is worth a look. You don't see so much of it these days because both the far left and the far right know that given the technology and training that Department of Defense personnel and the federal, state, and local police in this country have now, as opposed to in the 60s or even in the 90s, is vastly increased. And those types of actions are just simply not as easily committed these days. And there's no point in it at this particular time. There's no need for any type of terrorist act, whether it's from the far left or the far right in this country. Now, having put the historical matter aside, I find far left egalitarianism Okay, and what you might call pseudo-communism to communism is well argued by them. But interestingly enough, equally the far right's ideas of racial identity, what some call Christian identity, differences of the races, the idea of the melting pot experiment and its pros and cons, the effectiveness or efficiency of people when they are exposed to members of one race as opposed to members of another race, and how those people go about their lives as opposed to people who were raised in a different way. They make some interesting points on their side too. All right, the far left and the far right in this country have, in many respects, balanced out the thinking of the American populace and what the American population's ideas of extremism and radicalism is. Okay, you're always going to have in every community, in every society, in every city, anywhere in the world, people that have views that are considered fringe views by the mainstream. It doesn't mean that you're wrong if you're far right. It doesn't mean you're wrong if you're mainstream. It doesn't mean you're wrong if you're far left. It's just simply a fact of life that there are always going to be fringe thinkers in every society. Now, when that fringe thinking manifests in antisocial ways, such as terrorism, foreign or domestic, well, that's not good. That's not good for anybody, because it puts countries at odds with each other, and it has the capacity to make countries look good or bad depending on their response to the terroristic or domestic terroristic actions. Now, I would like to form sort of a line between domestic terrorism and foreign terrorism. So, the first major act of foreign terrorism in this country was the 9/11 attacks. Okay, that pit America and its allies all against Iraq, who was thought to have been the primary driver of the 9/11 cataclysm. Now, to compare that event to the October 7th attacks in Israel, okay, the Israeli government has dubbed the October 7th attacks as Israel's 9/11. Okay, 1,500 slaughtered in the street from machine gun fire from what has been reported to be Hamas terrorists. What triggered that event? It's difficult to say. The Palestinians and the Palestinians and the Israelis have been fighting over Jerusalem for 77 years now. It is an old fight. It is an old war. It is an old skirmish. And even with all the data that we have on that particular skirmish, even given all the data that we have, it's still difficult to know the motivations. Okay, the generations of hostility between the two. You know, some people have argued that in that event, which was a terrorist attack, I mean, slaughter 1,500 in the street, that's terrorism. Okay? That Israel's response was genocide. Now, this is something that was brought up by the South African government to the United Nations. That's what Israel is accused of. Now, this matter, okay, which some has painted as good versus evil, or terrorist versus patriot, or militant activity versus noble military might, right? Okay, who's to say, given the complexity of that skirmish, that Israel is right or wrong for their reply to it? It's a matter of watching, learning, and researching the relationship between the Palestinians and the Israelis over the past 80 years. Okay? This is a very common response by the Israelis to what it perceives to be Palestinian aggression. So, for example, in 2006, 2007, all the way up to probably 2010, there was quite a bit of this happening between the Palestinians and the Israelis, where the Palestinians would shoot rockets into Tel Aviv, and the Israeli government would respond with these 20 megaton bomb attacks. That's the state of Israel's preferred response to that. I'm not here to judge what's wrong or what's right with respect to that conflict, or respect to how the militaries react to one another. This is simply the preferred military strategy of the Israeli government, is to respond 100 times the intensity of the original attack. That is simply how they operate. And who's to say from 5,000 miles away here in South Florida that what Israel does to protect its homeland is right or wrong? I don't live in the area. I've never been to Israel. I've never been to Palestine. But I do know this, that in the theater of war, cataclysms happen. It's unfortunate, but it's simply the truth. Every war that's ever been fought in recorded history has civilian casualties and tragic losses of life, many of which had nothing to do with the original conflict. And this war, which I suppose has relaxed itself in recent months, is no different. My thinking is this: I can wholly understand the Palestinian Authority's Hamas auxiliary wanting a better life for Palestinians. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I also don't think there's anything wrong with the Israeli government wanting a happy life for Israelis. These two nations, Israel and Palestine, have that in common. They want a happy life for their respective constituents. And since they have that in common, that commonality is a good starting point for peace talks. They don't have much in common. They don't have religion in common. The Israelis are far and away of the Jewish cultural tradition, and the Palestinians, as well as the greater Muslim world, are more of the, or rather vastly, hands down, the majority of these persons are of the Muslim cultural tradition. They don't have that in common. They don't have that in common. They don't have a language in common. In Israel, they speak probably mostly English and Hebrew, and the Arabs speak mostly the Arabic language, and then with the Iranians speaking the Farsi and Persian language, the Farsi or Persian language, and there are various minor languages spoken in the Middle East too. These countries, they don't have a language in common. They don't have much of anything in common at all, and quite frankly, both feel that they're entitled to the same plot of land. But again, they each want their citizens to be happy and to be prosperous and to enjoy their time on this earth while they have it. I think Israel and Palestine both want that. So start there and come to some agreement on what you're going to do with Jerusalem. Maybe do a heads or tails coin flip. Okay, you flip a coin. Heads, Israel gets it. Tails, the Palestinians get it. You can't argue with it. The results are concrete and irrefutable. That's my solution to the problem, ladies and gentlemen. When you talk about terrorism, you talk about a term that's thrown around. It's thrown around more loosely these days than it has in the past. In the past, if you had a situation where there was a terrorist action, for example, in the United States, there would be clear definitions and standards attached to it, and it was a more narrow term. You had to be affiliated with a group, or maybe you're what they call a lone wolf terrorist, and you do all your own terrorism on your own time, or they were some sort of indoctrinated person. Somebody that may have bought explosives on the black market or made them themselves, homemade explosives, and committed a heinous terrorist act somewhere. There were fairly standard definitions that were a little clearer cut. Nowadays, the definition it's evolved. It's more fluid. It's not less efficient. It's probably more efficient, the new definition of terrorism, because it's more fluid. And it includes other acts aside from what you might call your traditional act of terrorism. For example, blowing up a market or a concert or a casino or some other crowded place. Now the definition is it's more fluid, and there are more cases of a criminal nature, of a homicidal nature, that can be characterized as terrorism. It's not simply as cut and dry as Osama bin Laden hiring people sending people to blow up a skyscraper or something like that. So the definition of terrorism these days is a lot more fluid. How is it applied to the Cuban state, ladies and gentlemen? That is the topic of this lecture. And how does it relate to gangstalking? The standard definition of of terrorism are acts that are essentially cataclysmic to large numbers of people. Even if that act is simply to cause an instance of shock and awe for a person or persons, that would result in their demise. So, with Cuba, they're accused of being a state sponsor of terrorism. Okay? Now, I said at the beginning of the lecture that countries that have quite a bit of that are have been reported, anyhow, of being rife with corrupted persons. Now, here's the thing. Okay? And I said it at the beginning of this lecture. Terrorism is for sale. All right? It is no longer simply a person with ideological misfit ideas carrying out a heinous or stunning act in public. Okay? It's for sale. You can purchase terrorism, ladies and gentlemen. You can purchase what they do. Even if it's just for a singular act, somewhere, anywhere, you can purchase the terrorist mechanism. Okay? So what it would appear to me, and here's what I mean by that. Okay? People that know how to do the kinds of things that a terrorist would know how to do. Okay, the handling of grenade launchers, the handling of fully automatic assault rifles, the handling of various other ballistics and explosives, being able to maneuver about in tactical gear, or lock picking, or getaway driving, or the handling of various explosive and semi-explosive materials. Knowing how to stage a perimeter. Okay, these are things that the average person doesn't know anything about. Like, for example, if you were to go to the average person and say, if you had to clear a room of 100 people tonight, right now, would you know how to do that? The average person would say, no, I wouldn't know how to do that. But there are specialists and people who are trained in these types of things, clearing rooms, the planting of explosive devices, the detonating of these devices, the use of hazardous, the maintenance and use of hazardous chemicals. Okay, professional arsonists, persons that know how to modify weapons. So all of these are skills that someone who is readying themselves for terrorist actions would have. And the kinds of people that have these skills can be hired on the black market as mercenaries. And they plan it out like they would a heist. Okay, and when I say a heist, I mean a bank robbery or a Brinks truck robbery or something like that. Your typical heist. So people that have those kinds of skills that are obviously, they don't work for law enforcement. These are skills that military personnel and law enforcement are taught so that they can maximize their effectiveness in the field. But there are also certain individuals, everyday people, who have acquired these skills independently and could carry out any number of hostile or terroristic attacks anywhere for the right price. You understand? They're mercenary terrorists. Okay, they're not affiliated with any particular ideology. They're not affiliated with any particular religion. They're not affiliated with any particular country, region, or cause. They're simply terrorists for hire. And you can hire them to do terrorist activities. And the terrorism industry is a real industry now, okay? Because look, these militant groups are purchasing explosives on the black market. That's raising revenues for someone. They're purchasing explosives, they're purchasing firearms and ammunition, body armor, you know. Camouflage gear, walkie-talkies and radios. Okay, a terrorist network makes a lot of purchases on the black market for the kinds of things that they need to carry out terrorist actions. And there are terrorist groups that are either loosely or tightly affiliated with a central terrorist group. And these affiliations are they're less, in my opinion, active threat than they might have been in the 80s, 90s, or even the early 2000s. Nowadays, I think these networks are simply networks of, I guess you could call it advanced, sort of like an advanced mob culture. It's an advanced mob culture. It's about data gathering. Yeah, it's about black market activities. It's about money laundering, you know, business construction. Probably deals with the governments, you know, government contracts. I mean, it's very mafioso in its execution now, as opposed to in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s when it was just constant acts of people blowing up stuff whenever and however they could at the drop of a hat. There's more of an organized crime, mafioso type of ringleader type setup to terrorism in today's world. And I think that's the kind of terrorism that the state of Cuba has sponsored. I think that, you know, with the Cuban government, you know, being communist, and mind you, I'm of the mindset that communism has worked beautifully in some countries. Okay, I think it's worked beautifully in China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, Vietnam, okay, a number of countries. I think it's worked well. I think it's worked well for those countries given the history and the culture of the countries that do practice communism. It fits their, I guess, their collective mindset and their collective work ethic better than, for example, the United States, which has been capitalist from its inception and who has essentially created a capitalist world power in which the markets or the consumer behaviors drives the markets. Now, given a country like Cuba, who I believe it relies heavily on Russia and China for its sustenance, its political sustenance, but, you know, as far back as I can remember, okay, even going back into the 1990s, uh, I've always heard of Cuba in the American news media as being reclusive, as being shut off, closed off. You know, it's no man's land. You don't go there, they don't come here, we don't do business there, you know, et cetera, and there are lots of laws enforcing our distance from Cuba. So as far back as I can remember, that's been the policy. But over time, obviously, there's been some relaxation in those policies. There's been some relaxation in those policies, and it's easier to get to and from Cuba than it ever has been. And this news of the United States ambassador to the United Nations calling Cuba a terrorist state or a state-sponsored terrorism, it shocked me. It surprised me. But I believe Ambassador Waltz's judgment to be accurate. This is not the first time in American history that it's designated Cuba as a terrorist state or as a state sponsor of terrorism. This has happened before, several times before. And it always comes back to corruption. It isn't just the sponsoring of terrorists. And I think that they may be employed by the Cuban government. And I believe that these are terrorists for hire now. That they're employed by the Cuban government almost as a second police force. They patrol areas in various cities in Cuba as the police would. And I've almost come to the conclusion, based on some things that I've read, that these terrorist networks that are active in Cuba are actually wards or components of the Cuban state. And it's not just the Cuban government buying and selling firearms to terrorist organizations. I think these terrorists are being used in Cuba for defense missions, for mercenary-style defense missions. And also sort of a shadow police force in Cuba. And the reason I say that is because I see it here in Miami-Dade County. There are obviously terror cells here. And seeing as how the United States federal government is very anti-terrorist, that means these terror cells have to be under the jurisdiction of a foreign country. And when I hear Mike Waltz assert that Cuba is a state sponsor of terrorism, then that makes sense to me. These have to be affiliated. These terror cells that I'm referencing have got to be affiliated with the Cuban government. And I see them. I see them around. They use gang stalking to track people. They use the same signaling mechanisms that people that practice gang stalking use. And I see them. I know where they're from. I know what their business is. All right, there's a lot of illegal activity going on in Miami-Dade County, and it's not the fault of the mayor, okay, Mayor Daniela Levine Cava, who I consider to be an excellent mayor, or the recently appointed sheriff, Sheriff Rosie Cordero Stutz, who I think is doing an excellent job in her capacity as well. I think that when you're talking about a county that's got a population in the millions, and especially given its international location and its international populace and its diverse, I guess you could call it diverse mindset among the populace. Everybody's here for something different, but everybody wants something. All right, Miami-Dade County is like a treasure chest for some people. There are people of all different walks of life that come down here to try and do better, than they would anywhere else in the country. And also some of the world's foremost tricksters, con artists, homicidal hitmen, and lot pickers and burglars and dope smugglers, drug mules, sex workers from all over the country come here to see how well they can do here as opposed to somewhere else. And with that particular description, I'm not putting the adult industry or the sex work industry in the same category as those other criminal occupations. Okay? The former is federally taxed and regulated, okay? And the latter isn't. Okay? But some of the sex workers act as just plain street prostitutes, and that is something that violates the U.S. criminal code. So it's almost like people of all kinds of criminal backgrounds make their rounds down here to see if they can put their criminal background to use. And it's almost like the Olympics of criminal behavior in many respects. You got people from all 50 states. All of them have criminal backgrounds. All of them have different skills and talents that they have in the world of criminality. And they all want to come down here to Miami-Dade County so that they can put their talents, their criminal talents, to use and see if they can make a big score here. It's almost like the American Idol of criminal behavior. You remember that show American Idol? It was real popular in the early 2000s. You had singers from all across the country going to, I think it was Las Vegas, to meet with 3 celebrity judges and try to sing their way onto the show and then sing their way into a recording contract over and above their competition. Well, down here in Miami-Dade County, you have the American Idol of criminal backgrounds. You got people from all 50 states, including Alaska and Hawaii, coming here on boats and planes, driving, in helicopters. Some of them have come into this. Some of them fly down here on hang gliders and hot air balloons. Some come down here on Greyhounds. Some drive, some hitchhike, some take Ubers from another state down here. They're coming down here in droves, and they are not to be trifled with, ladies and gentlemen. They are motivated. They are excited. They have been career criminals. They have honed their skills and their talents in the world of crime, and they have all come down here in unison with one monolithic voice under the banner of becoming the best criminals they could possibly be. Right here in Miami-Dade County. But, ladies and gentlemen, let's not forget the ones that have that terroristic capacity. All right? We got the Miami-Dade Sheriff's Office now. We got the Broward County Sheriff's, the West Palm Beach Sheriff. We have the Palm Beach County Sheriff. We have the St. Lucie County Sheriff. We have the FBI. We have an FBI office centered here in Miami. Countless local law enforcement agencies. We have a Coast Guard. We have Air Force bases here. There are a lot of law enforcement and active military activity here that is more than capable of stunting the growth of these pickpocket epidemics or what have you. Persons coming from all over to show off their stuff here. And then when you the various law enforcement bodies here, I think they handle it in waves, because those elements come to Miami-Dade County in waves at various points in times during the year, and the police handle them, the sheriff's deputies, they handle them in waves until those waves retreat or recede, and then the next year, around the same time of year, they start coming back down in waves again. But when you separate street crimes from terrorism, right? Where are the terror cells coming from, and who's nurturing them? And on top of that, if there are terror cells in Miami-Dade County, which I just given the culture and some of the gang stalking I'm seeing down here, I don't doubt for a second that there are terror cells that are down here that work in tandem with cartels, okay, and other various third parties here in Miami-Dade County as almost a personalized, nationalistic, inward pointing patrol force. I mean, they're not sworn officers. They're not bound by the state constitution of Florida. They're not bound by the U.S. Constitution. They're essentially terror networks that deal in drugs, deal in human trafficking, dealing in weapons and arms, dealing in explosives, and they have a hitman industry, and they carry out hits for persons for untold sums, and it's a money making it's a money generation thing. So if Cuba as a country is employing terrorism in any way or sponsoring terrorism in any way, it is going to generate revenue for the Cuban government somewhere. Okay, even if the terrorists that they're affiliating with are internationally known terrorists, all right, even if they're internationally known terrorists, there's a protocol and a procedure to how to deal with it. I think the discovery of terrorist networks and terror cells is the beginning of it. Me personally, these guys, it's obvious that staged accidents, staged confrontations, mob hits, vehicular homicide, food contamination, the use of chemicals and poisons against people, the shootout mechanism, various other assassination tactics are used in these terror cells, and quite frankly, I don't think this is something that should go unexamined. This is something that needs to be examined, because you got people in South Florida who have no terrorist affiliations and no criminal affiliations that are being targeted by terror cells for this reason or that. Is that something that we want in the United States? Okay. Is it possible that Cuba has enlisted terrorist organizations as an auxiliary to their military force? It's possible. It's possible. Is it possible that they have these terroristic affiliations as a way of keeping outsiders away? That to me is a more likely scenario, because, and this is based on observation, just having lived here in Miami-Dade County for approximately 9 years now, I've noticed that the Cuban population here likes homogenous communities. And quite frankly, I don't think there's anything wrong with that in and of itself. There are lots of ethnic minorities that like homogenous communities. The Haitians like homogenous communities. The Jamaicans like homogenous communities. The Middle Eastern population here in Miami-Dade County, they like homogenous communities. Caucasians that live here, the African Americans that live here, they like homogenous communities as well. It's not a defect to like homogenous communities. Homogenous communities are the natural order of things. When you have people of different ethnic, racial, or cultural backgrounds living in a geographic area among one another, by nature, they're likely going to form homogenous communities. Okay, my significant other, Lori, she lived in Dallas, Texas for much of her young life. She lived in a homogenous community. Okay, it was mostly Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And there were a lot of those types of communities here in the United States in those times. And having seen the degree in which the Cuban population here likes homogenous communities, it would not at all surprise me if their home nation, which is Cuba, has taken its desire for a homogenous country to a whole nother level, and possibly employed the use of terrorist networks to scare off non-Cubans. Now, I'm of the mindset, ladies and gentlemen, that homogenous communities, as I said earlier, are the natural order of things. Most people gravitate towards their own kind if given the chance to fellowship or associate or live or work or go into interpersonal relationships with any number of persons. The overwhelming vast majority of people on planet Earth live in communities that are comprised of people like themselves, racially, ethnically, culturally, linguistically. Okay? In the United States, I think cities, particularly in the Midwestern area and in the southern states, have become more integrated than the rest of the country for various cultural reasons. But homogenous communities still remain here in the United States, as with anywhere. It's just the natural order of things. People tend to seek out, for example, in America, communities that have people of a similar cultural background, perhaps a similar tax bracket, similar familial status, similar educational attainment. People tend to seek out cities and neighborhoods that are populated with people that are similar to them in these various ways. I do believe that Cubans, more so than other ethnic minorities in the United States, like homogenous communities. And I think Cubans like their homogenous communities to a much deeper degree than do other ethnic minorities in the United States. I mean, you know, typically, just from what I've noticed, you know, all right, so in any Midwestern or Southern state in particular, okay, a white family moves into a mostly black neighborhood, everyone shrugs their shoulders, it happens. Same deal. A black family migrates to a white neighborhood, everyone shrugs their shoulders, it happens. You know, there'll always be that certain group that, you know, the black family that sees the white family and says, I don't want to share a neighborhood with them, and then they move, or the white family that sees the blacks move in and say, I don't want to share a neighborhood with them, and then they move. But I think by and large, over and away, and the vast majority of people don't really get that much into these days who's living in our neighborhood with respect to their race. It's more of a situation now where it's like, you know, we don't care who lives around us, just as long as they're decent enough to be able to afford the lifestyle and the standard of living that this community demands. And if you can meet that standard, then you shouldn't have any problems in that particular community. But Cubans very much, in my estimation, value homogenous communities, even to the point where in various parts of Miami-Dade County, the gang-stalking mechanism is being deployed by these homogenous communities against persons who don't quite look like they're what you might refer to as full-fledged members of these communities. And the Cuban state, given its isolationist past and its isolationist reputation, would almost certainly deploy the use of terroristic functions and groups to achieve its goals of isolationism. Okay, it's not just raising funds from human trafficking or dope smuggling or arms dealing or murder for hires or various types of similar criminality. Okay, it's a matter where these things are revenue generators for officials in the Cuban government. I mean, how does this happen in a country? Okay, especially with the technology we have, especially in a situation like Cuba where it's got two economic, we'll call them economic allies because they have the same communal economic ideology, okay, in Russia and in
Video
China.
by Emmanuel Isaiah Smith.
In my opinion, world power countries that help Cuba stabilize itself economically under communist objectives and financial goals. And as I said before, in my estimation, a good political ideology is any political ideology that works. Communism works for these countries that I named earlier in the lecture, and they've made it work probably as well as humanly possible. You know, and the same with capitalism. The countries that practice capitalism practice it as well as humanly possible. And in my estimation, with Cuba, it's a way of keeping people out. Terrorists are fully capable of using gang stalking techniques. Terrorists are fully capable of using shock and awe tactics. They're perfectly capable of running dope. They're perfectly capable of committing any crime under the sun. There's no limit to the criminality that terrorists are capable of, and they can also generate revenues for you. Okay, on the black market, because they're good at underground activity. They're good at underground activity. They're good at they're good at essentially anything black market. Okay, arms dealing, people smuggling, narcotic smuggling. I mean, across the spectrum of criminal activity. It's just there's nothing that a terrorist. They're bred for black market activity. It's not just terrorism, it's black market activity that drives terrorism. Okay, they're not incorporated. Okay, they're not incorporated businesses. All right, terrorist group A LLC, terrorist group B LLC, terrorist group C LLC. There is none of that in terrorism. It's all off the grid, which is why we have to spend upwards of $2 trillion a year in tax dollars to the military-industrial complex to make the kind of technology we need to sniff out terrorists. And because they work off the grid, it makes them more deadly. They don't just blow up buildings, they're survival experts. Just 1 second, I need a sip of water, ladies and gentlemen. So when you talk about Cuba being labeled as a state sponsor of terrorism, in my mind, it's the economic aim. It's the economic angle. Okay, Cuba has upwards of 2 million of its citizens having migrated here to the United States. Probably in the past 30 years. So it's like this. Cuba is not a traditional terrorist state in the sense that, well, they must hate America or they want to orchestrate terrorist activities here. No. They have people living here. And they don't want to blow up or do anything terroristic in a country that has its own people living here, because something could happen to them in the act, or they could be negatively affected by it. You can hire terrorists to do stuff that regular thugs might not be as good at. Perhaps the Cuban government uses terrorist organizations to keep a lid on the people and to keep them from dissenting. And I think that part of it is this. Do I believe personally that it's possible to bring humanity to a level of 0% crime in every country, 0 crimes committed in an entire year, or from now on, 0 crimes in every country? Yes, I believe that's possible. But until that day comes, I think that there are countries like Cuba who are still on the developing side that may employ the use of terrorists for domestic reasons, to do off-the-grid work or off-the-grid crime fighting. You see? I think that ultimately the state sponsor of terror is an appropriate label for Cuba. I think its government has lost its way, and I would like to see Cuba lose those affiliations. I would like to see it lose those affiliations and get off that list. You know, that list is a list of countries that the United States is militarily cautious of. I think the countries I think there are 4 or 5 countries. I think it's Cuba, Iran, Syria, and North Korea, which in and of themselves are beautiful countries. And they all have really neat histories. But I think that these are the countries that the United States has deemed a potential threat to the American way of life. And I'd like to see all those countries come off that list. I'd like to see all those countries come off the list completely. From having diplomatic actions and making peace treaties. You see, embargoes and sanctions are, in my opinion, leaving money on the table for entrepreneurs in every country. I don't think embargoes or sanctions are good for anybody. It'd be nice if we had a global economy with no embargoes and no sanctions anywhere. If all countries could find a common ground of progression for their people and do business politically and militarily, economically and otherwise, think of how safe and prosperous this world would be over the next 50 years, over the next 100 years. So if all countries were to come off, and I think America was placed on Iran's list of terrorist countries in retaliation. I think this happened sometime in 2008 or 2009. So imagine a world where everyone is clear of that terrorist state label. No one has that label. Imagine how much more prosperous and financially well off the people would be, because you have more countries doing business with each other without the embargoes and sanctions. So, you know, if the global community can put away its age-old skirmishes and historical conflicts and various biases and prejudices of other people and other cultures and so forth, then the global economy can really get to kicking again. But with all these embargoes and sanctions and tariff wars, I mean, they're all fun to watch. It's political theater. But how does the global economy fare? How do we get the poverty rate to zero? The way to do that is through diplomacy, aggressive international diplomacy, good foreign relations, and the disarmament of certain items. And I think things will be a lot better off, a lot less politically dicey and so forth, because this designation of Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism, it's a dicey accusation. And it comes in a time where there's a sizable Cuban American population in Miami-Dade County. I mean, what does that designation do to their morale? Does it make them more optimistic about being a part of the American experiment? Or does it make them less optimistic about being a part of the American experiment? In my estimation, the United States is no place for terrorism, and neither is the Caribbean. So, with a label like having been designated by the United States as a state sponsor of terrorism, I think what it does is it gives Cuba an incentive to put away some of the activity that the United States has deemed terroristic or basically government sanctioned mob activity. So, with respect to that is the cornerstone of the accusation: organized mob activity leading up to terrorism. And as always, ladies and gentlemen, I invoke my First Amendment right under the U.S. Constitution to say and assert as I please on these podcasts, on these lectures. And as a person that lives 98 miles away from Cuba, which, again, it doesn't strike me as the kind of country that would send terrorists over here to wreak havoc. It seems to me that the terrorists in particular that the Cuban government is sponsoring, a number of them have to have operations in Cuba, and a number of them have to have operations here in Miami, which is culturally very similar to various points in Cuba. But when you start talking about governments as state sponsors of terrorism, that means state-sanctioned murder. So at some point, the United States had to have gotten some sort of a document or memo or chart or other piece of documentation showing where the Cuban state sponsored, knowingly, terrorist groups in any country for any reason. As well as the state sponsoring of drug cartels and human trafficking rings. It isn't difficult to see or gauge how a government benefits from activity like terrorism or domestic or human trafficking or drug cartel activity? And the answer lies in not necessarily the governments, but the people that staff the governments. So, if you talk about Cuba, for example, is it the will of the people for Cuba to be a state sponsor of terrorism, human trafficking, and drug cartel activity? I don't think it's the will of the Cuban people, but there are obviously Cuban officials that profit from that. Okay, they profit from the human smuggling. They probably get a percentage of the proceeds that they get, that the smuggling rings get. Okay, they probably get a portion of the proceeds from black market sales of weapons and drugs in exchange for allowing it to happen and possibly protecting the activity using state resources. And the state sponsor of terrorist organizations is profitable as well, because if they're sponsoring those organizations in countries that are known for that type of activity, the countries might be supporting Cuba in return in various or the officials of the Cuban government in return, probably with offshore bank accounts and stock options and various companies and corporate kickbacks for the sponsoring of terrorism, which is itself a business. All right, they're not just people that commit these terrorist acts. They have people that are able to do all kinds of crimes for profit. And some of the terrorists are mercenaries. And when you combine all these elements into a mesh of data and you break it down item by item, if the result is Cuba is a participant in these things, then it's just simply a participant in these things. There's no way to mince the words. Either Cuba is a state sponsor of terrorism or it's not. And there were no exhibits presented, as exhibits are never presented in United Nations speeches. But the finished product of all the evidence that's gathered is presented in United Nations talks. So when Mike Waltz went up in front of the United Nations, 100 member countries, and said that Cuba is a state sponsor of terrorism, then for all intents and purposes, based on aggregate data that the U.S. federal government has collected over the years on Cuba, Cuba is a state sponsor of terrorism. Okay, there's no gray area. All right, and it's a pitiful situation when you have one of the most sought after counties in the United States having a majority population whose home country was designated by this country as terrorist. It's a situation where their morale and their sense of belonging here in the United States is greatly diminished. And I'm not saying that it's the United States' obligation in and of itself to make this group feel welcome or that group feel welcome here, or make this demographic feel unwelcome or make that demographic feel unwelcome. It's not about that. This is a free market capitalist country. The markets drive the action. And as far as the eye can see, merits, talent, skills, work ethic, and education drive the action here too. But you have to factor in that competition is only afforded to certain United States citizens. There are United States citizens that are systematically held back by various clandestine protocols like gangstalking and its workplace mobbing mechanisms. So, that mechanism makes it so that no matter how dedicated or skilled you are at a job, you will lose it at some point. And a career-injuring fashion, and that's part of gang stalking. See my video on workplace mobbing. It's on my YouTube. It's here on Facebook as well for more information on that product. Yeah, so I mean that's something that the Cuban population here has to have hanging over their heads at this point in time. Is that the country they live in believes that the country of their heritage is a state-sponsored terrorism, and ultimately, anyone in my estimation that participates in gang stalking is participating in terrorism. Gang stalking is terroristic in its function. It's a cataclysm-based protocol. Okay, it's based off of catastrophes. Its goal is to cause catastrophes. The entire product operates off of catastrophes and cataclysms in the lives of the targeted persons caused by the gang stalkers themselves. Okay, as a part of a social engineering trick that's supposed to make society either run better or run more according to the personal ideas of society held by the orchestrators and participants of clandestine gang stalking. And apparently the U.S. federal establishment is allowing this program to run right now as an experiment. They want to see exactly what effect it has on the populace, what effect it has on law and order, what effect it has on business and the markets, what effect it has on politics, what effect it has on medicine, what effects it has on the population numbers. You see, gang stalking is being allowed to run as both an operation and an experiment into governmental processes and governmental functions. And apparently some targeted individuals got railroaded in their targeted campaigns. Like myself, you're constantly running into not only disruptions, but various dangers and perils that would not be present if the stalkers weren't present. So I call it unconstitutional on those grounds. But looking back, ladies and gentlemen, at this situation in Cuba, so, me personally, I'm an African American. My roots go back to probably 94% probability that my DNA on both sides of my family originates in the Congo in Central Africa. Now, my mother's side of the family has a lot more Native American and Scottish extracts than my father's side. My father's side is just plainly African and American, and whatever the general racial mixture is of regular African Americans. And my mother's side is African American mostly, some Native American, and a small percentage of Scottish. So that's my racial heritage right there. And as a person whose roots go back to what would today be the Democratic Republic of the Congo. If the United States were to put out a press release or something saying that the Democratic Republic of the Congo was designated as a state-sponsored terrorism, I would be shocked and stunned. I would be shocked and stunned, and I would hope that the Democratic Republic of the Congo would do whatever it took to get its name off of that list. And I know Cuban Americans feel the same. The United States federal government has designated their home country or their country of ethnic origin as a state sponsor of terrorism in an open forum in front of the United Nations for the whole world to hear. My hope is that Cuba does whatever it has to do to get its name off that list. And I hope certainly that it hasn't sent any terrorism cells down here to Miami-Dade County to scope me out. And I'm hoping that it pulls through in that capacity, and I hope that it is able to eventually get its name off the list. But you know, it's funny too, because I see a lot of expatriates of Cuba here in the United States, and some of them don't appear to like Cuba very much at all. They think it's oppressive, they think it's corrupt, they think it's a lot of things. I want to like the Cuban government. I do. I want to like them. Okay, when I was growing up, the only thing I really ever heard about the Cuban government was that it was run by a man named Fidel Castro, who was a revolutionary and a terrorist. That was all I ever heard about Cuba growing up as a kid. And that was my only image of Cuba until 2018. Quite frankly, I moved to Miami because of the weather, and I knew it would give me more of an opportunity to be out and about and watching people in vehicles and the gang stalking maneuvers that they bring. Now, that was my goal, was to be able to observe gang stalking from a more spaced out posture. And I didn't do much research on the demographic makeup of South Florida. I thought it would be like Ohio when I first came here. And I quickly realized, probably within the first week, that all over Miami-Dade County is pretty much a Spanish-speaking, Hispanic, and or Cuban demographic. So when I learned that, it made me look at the geographic political narrative, okay, particularly concerning gang stalking, a little differently. I looked at it a little differently because I was able to see that it's even more of a dedicated system than I ever thought possible. You don't have to know English to participate in gang stalking. You can know any language. But its auspices, its operation is the same. Its disruption and its disenfranchisement posing as safety and security measures. They aren't safety and security measures. There are gang stalkers in all 50 states right now driving around in vehicles looking for a signal that will lead them crashing into a pedestrian or a biker or another car. For the thrill of it. I wouldn't doubt in my mind that most hit and run accidents in the United States are the result of a gang stalker who took a signal that led to someone getting run over. A person driving a car can take signals from pedestrians and motorists as to when to turn and how fast to go. If a staged car collision has been put upon someone, targeted individual or not, the car collision you experienced that day is staged and derived. Someone took a signal to make this turn or that, which can lead to a cataclysm. Okay, that's terrorism. That's vehicular terrorism. If you're using your weapon, if you're using your car as a weapon, and the use of that car as a weapon causes in the destruction of another person, that's terrorism. And the reason it's terrorism is because it's not an isolated incident. It's a part of a machine of people who drive in cars looking for signals for when to slam on the gas pedal or make a turn. Okay, that is terrorism by motorists. And it's a part of the clandestine gang stalking mechanism. It's all a part of the same system. It's all a part of the same blueprint, the same architectural structure that is gang stalking. It includes the use of vehicles as weapons against people. All right? Now, how much of an influence does the Cuban government have here in Miami? I think it's considerable influence. And the reason I think it's a considerable influence is because I think it seeks to put an air of familiarity in Miami-Dade County to the Cuban population here. It wants the Cuban population here to feel like this is a second home to them. Like this is an auxiliary of Cuba or a component of Cuba. And I think that the Cuban government has operations here that assist in that. But I think there are darker operations that are also a part of this conversation that we're having, and that's the terroristic aspect of it. All right, it doesn't have to be hooded or masked men. Pulling up in an unmarked van, wielding machine guns, and blasting you. It doesn't have to be that. It could be a group of guys who are terrorists, who are in plain clothes and just look like a crew of guys. But they are trained in those mechanisms and they know how to carry out those types of attacks. And they carry out those types of attacks and make them look like street crimes. But in reality, it's acts of terrorism. So I think that this is a matter that the U.S. federal government should take very seriously. And I hope that this situation, this matter, works out in the interest of all. Because given Cuba's proximity to the United States, I think a healthy Cuba makes for a healthy Miami-Dade County and vice versa. Because Miami-Dade County is Cuba's strongest link to American culture and society. And I know the Cuban government wants its people to be safe at home and abroad. But I don't think using terrorist networks to ensure that is a good idea. Okay, do we really want those kind of tensions between the United States, which is a capitalist country, and Cuba, which is a communist country? I mean, wouldn't tensions between the United States and Cuba cause tensions between the U.S., Russia, and China, and North Korea, and Iran? Okay, being the world's, I'll throw Vietnam in there too, because these countries that I've just named are considered the world's most successful communist countries in terms of their gross national product and their gross domestic product. I think that the United States of America, its federal government, was right in their designation of Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism, but it's not a moment of rejoicing. You see, I would like to see Cuba as a country do what it needs to do politically to get rid of that designation, because that designation doesn't make it look good as a country, and it could cast a negative light on the residents that live here in the United States, which is also something that Cuba doesn't want. So ultimately, I think that the burden has been rightfully and responsibly placed upon the Cuban government by the United States to clean up certain activities that it has been found to have participated in, I think it would be a good investment for Cuba as a country, especially as a country that's this close to the United States, 91 miles from here. To give up those activities, I think it would be a good investment for the Cuban government to have a good relationship with the U.S., given its proximity to the U.S., and given the number of Cuban nationals that live here in the U.S., in Miami-Dade County in particular. I think it would behoove the Cuban government to reduce the element of terrorism and organized crime that has been found to have been participating in the interest of all parties involved. And I think such a move would behoove the United States of America as well, because keep in mind, that the intelligence and national security communities of the United States are going to be watching Miami-Dade County a little closer now too, now that Cuba has been officially labeled as a state sponsor of terrorism by the United States. And I think that its goal at this point should be not to offend the United States too deeply, because, I mean, if you think about it, let's say there are drug cartels, human smuggling rings, and terror cells here in the United States. What that would mean is that, I mean, they didn't originate here. This is not the Miami of the 70s and 80s. All right, this Miami is very much more regulated than the Miami of the 70s and 80s, and it's less run by mob interests than the Miami of the 70s and 80s. Furthermore, there's and at least in my estimation, a more dedicated state and local law enforcement presence here than in the 70s and in the 80s. And I think that reduces some of what we might refer to as cartel activity or organized crime or even terrorism. The U.S. military, the national security apparatus in this country, and the state and local police departments, federal, state, and local police departments are more ready for terroristic threats and actions than ever. And their response time to such activity is quicker than it's ever been. And quite frankly, given Cuba's size and its worldwide assets, all right, being exponentially smaller than the United States is, I don't think it's a great idea for Cuba as a country to continue with these political enterprises that consist of state-sponsored terrorism, human trafficking, and drug cartel activity. It just doesn't seem in Cuba's best interest or the American people's, because if the United States and its allies deepen their embargoes, okay, with respect to purchasing and selling commodities to Cuba, all right, and those embargoes turn into sanctions, it just doesn't seem to me that it would be in the welfare of the Cuban government or its people. So, it makes me think, well, it's got to be corruption, because the officials that are allowing that stuff to happen got to be profiting personally from it. Otherwise, why allow that to go on? Why allow such activity to go on in your country? So, there's definitely a follow the money element to it. I'm going to leave the lecture off there. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for listening.